Nobody said we got to get rid of Trump. Nobody said we've got to stop MAGA. Nobody, I mean, not a single person that I talked to on the Democratic side was saying anything about that. Nobody mentioned Trump, even the Republicans. Nobody said anything about it. What they said was our lives are not what they want them, some version of that, and we want to see a different, we want to see a different output. And that's not what moderates are going to offer.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like writer and political strategist Corbin Trent, who you heard up top. You might remember a conversation I had with him a few months ago where he offered some big-picture thoughts on how to advance a progressive agenda in the South and across the country. I wanted to have him back to put some of those ideas in a more specific context. The special congressional election last week right here in Tennessee. It generated a huge amount of national interest from the media and both major political parties, and its results were pretty interesting. We'll talk about it. That's coming up, and in our Arts and Culture segment, we'll pay tribute to the late Steve Cropper, one of the major figures in Southern soul music. Before I get to my conversation with Corbin, I want to set it up with a little background. We talk a lot on this podcast about the impacts of gerrymandering on political representation in the South, and we'll be talking about it plenty more as we get into 2026 because it's going to be a major factor in next year's elections. Tennessee is among the worst offenders. We have 9 congressional districts here, and 8 of them are currently held by Republicans, with boundary lines that were drawn to produce that result. It gives the GOP 89% of the seats in a state that voted 64% for President Donald Trump last year. That's a right-wing overrepresentation of 25%, effectively taking the voices of a quarter of the state's population. The most egregious thing the Republican supermajority in the legislature has done to give themselves that edge is to chop up Nashville, the state's capital and largest metro area, among 3 different congressional districts. That dilutes the power of Nashville's generally liberal voters and its sizable African-American population by parceling them out among mostly suburban and rural districts. It was one of those, the 7th congressional district, that was the center of the action and attention last week. It has been a reliably Republican district, taking in a slice of Nashville's west side and extending north to the Kentucky border and south to Alabama. It had been represented by conservative Congressman Mark Green until he resigned in June to start some kind of company to do business in Latin America. That led to last week's special election to complete the rest of his term. By conventional political metrics, there was no reason for the seat to generate much attention or hope from Democrats. Both Trump and Green carried the district by a 22-point margin just last year. But we aren't in conventional political times. Trump's approval ratings are falling, sitting below 40% in many national polls, and Democrats performed well in November's off-year elections, including in the South. As the next potentially significant bellwether on the calendar, the 7th district race took on outsized importance. There were competitive primary elections for the seat among both Democrats and Republicans in October, with the results pitting Democratic State Representative Afton Bain against Army veteran and state Republican apparatchik Matt Van Epps. Van Epps was endorsed by Trump in the primary, and he stuck to the MAGA script throughout his campaign, evading even questions about the Jeffrey Epstein files. Bain, meanwhile, echoed many of the themes sounded by last month's winning Democrats, from Zoran Mamdani in New York to Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. The high cost of living, access to health care, and the punishing effects of Trump's tariffs. National money poured into the race from both Republican and Democratic donors. A week before the election, the Tennessee Lookout reported that Democratic PACs had spent about $1.8 million on the election, and Republican PACs about $2.3 million. Heavy hitters from both parties also got involved. Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson spoke at a rally for Van Epps, and Trump even called in via speakerphone. Bain got public support from former Vice President Al Gore, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Probably you know the results. Last Tuesday, December 2nd, Van Epps successfully held the seat for the GOP, but by a much smaller margin than Green had posted a year earlier. Van Epps won 53.8% of the vote to 45.2% for Bain, a margin of 8.6%, down by more than 13 points from Green's win. Both sides declared victory of a sort. Republicans crowed about beating back Bain, who they had portrayed as a radical leftist. Democrats said her strong showing indicated how much the political tides have shifted since last November. And for once in Tennessee, the claims felt more sincere on the Democratic side. After the election, a headline in Politico said, "GOP frets dangerous result in Tennessee." One unnamed House Republican told the D.C. outlet, "Tonight is a sign that 2026 is going to be a bitch of an election cycle." A double-digit swing in a deep red district could suggest trouble for Republicans in less safe seats. In 2024, there were 23 Republicans who won congressional races with margins under 10%. Bain's gains were even more notable given who she is, a young vocal progressive who first came to public attention in 2018 as an activist, leading an effort to get a Republican state legislator who was accused of sexually assaulting teenage girls thrown out of the state legislature. She won her own seat in the state house in a special election in 2023, representing an area of Nashville, after beating a more establishment Democrat in the primary. She did the same again this year in the October primary for the congressional race, where she beat two longer-serving state legislators and a successful businessman. She was not, in other words, a safe centrist candidate, but she still made significant inroads. One other election last week, also worth mentioning. In Roswell, Georgia, an affluent suburb about 20 miles north of Atlanta, the mayor's office changed hands from a Republican to a Democrat. Incumbent Mayor Kurt Wilson, a Republican, had the backing of Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. But challenger Mary Robichaux, a former Democratic member of the Georgia state legislature, won the race, taking 53% of the vote. Roswell's not a small town. It has a population of about 92,000 people. But by itself, it wouldn't warrant much attention. As an emblem of the vast Atlanta suburbs, however, it could be significant. Georgia has major statewide races on the ballot next year. Senator John Ossoff, a Democrat, is up for re-election in a seat Republicans would dearly love to flip back after losing it in 2020. And with Kemp term limited, a fierce gubernatorial race is shaping up with a host of declared candidates from both parties. Atlanta itself is deep blue in its politics, but many more people live in the sprawling and politically competitive communities that surround it. Robichaux's win puts a blue dot in the middle of them. I wanted to talk about all of that with Corbin Trent. As you may remember from our prior conversation, Trent grew up in East Tennessee. He was a co-founder of Justice Democrats, a progressive political action committee formed by veterans of Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign. He also worked with Ocasio-Cortez, serving as her communications director, and for Sanders' 2020 campaign. Most recently, he launched a media project called America's Undoing, which you can find at americasundoing.com. He's using it to talk through the obvious challenges for progressives in the current political landscape, but also what he sees as opportunities and needs. He watched Bain's campaign closely and even went to Nashville to attend her election night watch party. As I expected, he had interesting things to say. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. All right, Corbin Trent, thanks a lot for jumping back on here.
I'm glad to be here. Always a pleasure, Seth. Glad to see you.
So let's start out just with your initial reactions to this election that we had. Obviously, the whole country was paying a whole lot of attention to Middle Tennessee, which doesn't happen that often, especially in a congressional race. I know you went over there on Election Day. You were at the watch party, the Afton-Bain election night party. So what'd you think?
First of all, just that I went there, I don't, generally speaking, do a lot of Tennessee politics. It's not really been my interest for a variety of reasons for a long time. So just the fact that I was interested enough to go there, I think, tells a story of, the same kind of interest, I went around the different counties and talked to voters and talked to people that hadn't voted. I just basically went around talking to people all over, Montgomery County. Obviously, I talked to people in Davidson, but then also in Perry and out in, I drove for hours and hours all around to different places, towns of 300, towns of 10,000. And what I took from it was that Democrats were extremely excited about ideas. They were extremely excited about things like affordable health care. They were extremely excited about things like funding schools. That, I heard ideas from the Democrats. When I asked them why they were voting for Afton, they were able to tell me something. They told me that it was about something they wanted that they thought Afton would help deliver. And then when I spoke to Republicans, the overwhelming majority of them basically said, well, I'm just a conservative and I vote Republican. It's just what I do, right? There was no real excitement about Epps. There was no real excitement even about the Republican Party's mission per se. It was more of a obligatory, just something they do, almost a robotic effort to go vote Republican. And that's both, that's a double-edged sword, right? Obviously, habitual voting, whether you habitually vote for Democrats or you habitually vote for Republicans, is it's harder to break than it might seem. But, when you look at places like West Virginia that used to be a Democratic trifecta, supermajorities in their state legislature, it was a blue state. And the same thing can be said about Tennessee. It used to be very purple at least, but then blue from time to time. And so what we do know is that things can change. And that, for me, was very exciting. Obviously, closing a 22-point Republican district to a 8 and change. Everybody's calling it 9, but it's 8 and change.
Yeah,
man.
yeah.
We gotta take the decimals.
Right. Those 8.6%, like that matters. Yeah.
Yeah. 8 and change. I'm going to call it 8 and change. 8 and change. And that in and of itself is obviously a big move. But the thing that really encouraged me the most was that there was beginning to be a vision articulated by the people that came out to vote. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can find and put together is a vision for the future that is different and that is sort of communicable, that people can say it when you ask them. And they did. They said it. I put out videos of people.
What were those things? Like, obviously, she talked a lot about affordability. She talked about access to health care. What were the things that you heard? It was
the campaign themes. That was it. I mean, they were picking up on the campaign themes of affordability. They were picking up on the campaign themes of health care. They were relating their life and the struggle that they're having in the richest nation in the history of the world and saying, this doesn't make sense. That was, nobody said the richest nation in the history of the world. I'm throwing that in there because the irony of it all. People were talking about the lack of fairness. I mean, a couple people did mention that Elon Musk is on the path to being a trillionaire and they can't afford health care.
And he's digging a giant ass hole in the middle of Nashville.
Digging a giant ass hole, And the other thing so people were talking like in, where was I? I was in Cumberland City. And I talked to the alderwoman there and a few other people. And it was like the polling station was in this little volunteer fire department, right? It just, and I was there for an hour and maybe 16 people voted. But I mean, it was a town of 311 people. So that's, pretty good turnout probably. And the people I talked to there that had voted for Afton, which was exciting to find anybody that had, they were talking about having to drive a long way to get dialysis treatment for his grandmother. And then some other woman was talking about they talked about the access to healthcare, about how far they had to drive twice. So that was something that they were experiencing. And, it was connecting lives to ideas in a campaign was what was coming through. And I hope we see more of that. That's the thing to me about the takeaway is that if moderate had ran, then we would have, if a moderate had run, I wouldn't have gone there. And I can guarantee you Davidson County wouldn't have. The theory of change that these people have is that if we just do nothing, then we're going to then we'll get the swing. Just sit back and let the swing happen. But that's not what I was hearing out there is that, I didn't hear, nobody said we got to get rid of Trump. Nobody said we've got to stop MAGA. Not a single person that I talked to on the Democratic side was saying anything about that. Nobody mentioned Trump. Even the Republicans. Nobody said anything about it. What they said was our lives are not what they want them, some version of that, and we want to see a different output. And that's not what moderates are going to offer. That's not what the sort of the centrist wing, because it's not really about being in the middle of a political spectrum. That's not what it's about. It's about basically saying nothing, that's offensive, saying nothing that means anything, and trying to be as palatable to as many people as possible. And what that means is
corporate donors too, right?
I think so. I think that's just sort of, I don't know if the Hakeem Jeffries and all these guys or the, deciding to win folks or all these think tanks are, maybe it is about appealing to donors, but I think some of them actually believe that that's the way to win, and that this, we were talking earlier about, somebody was saying that they were a big sports fan. And I think a lot of people are looking at this like a sports game, and that is it, right? How do we win? And they've got this theory of how they do it, and they really want to push this theory of how to win, just like a Moneyball guy would, right? But what's missing in that is why to win. I mean, the reason you want to win a football game is winning is the object, but politics, winning isn't the object. The object is what you do with your power, what you do when you win. And that is absent in so many of the analyses that I see coming out of this, just go to the middle, just do this, just do that. And that was not absent from Afton Bain's campaign. That is not absent from, Graham Plattner's campaign or Abdul El-Said's or any of the Justice Democrats candidates. They got 6 now running, Justin Pearson and all these. It's not absent. They have a vision they're trying to articulate and put together. And to me, that's what moves the needle. I'm a student of history, I guess. I'm obsessed with the time when America was building. And when you look at the calendar, or the map rather, and the makeup of Congress from like 30 to 36, that spread, we went from a Republican trifecta in one cycle, and within 3 cycles, we had Democratic supermajorities and trifecta because we were delivering quick, and that's just lost on so many people. Like the idea that we got to actually produce, they think Joe Biden did a great job because he passed bills that spent a lot of money, but I just had to have the rims on my car replaced yesterday because of all the potholes I drove through. They just spent $1.2 trillion on infrastructure, and I still got to buy new rims. I mean, it ain't coming into my house.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about the quality of the candidates as well. And I think maybe there's a connection here between candidates who are motivated by an actual vision of change, like you're talking about. They are, I think, going to be more likely to be people who are energetic, who are able to communicate and excite people. And, in all the talk about Afton Bain here, Zoran Mamdani in New York, the focus has been on, they're very, they're to the left end of the party, which is true. But to me, that kind of obscures, they're like objectively good candidates. Like they're young, they're charismatic, they're forthright, they come across with a great amount of authenticity because they're talking about things that they legitimately care about. You don't get the sense that this is, some triangulation that they're doing between these people want this and these people want that. They're able to go out there and they, do you think that that sort of centrist consultant class worries too much about where people land on a set of checklists and not enough about just how do they come across as people? How do they communicate and connect with voters regardless? Because, your average voter might not know or care that much about where exactly on the sort of center left to farther left spectrum a candidate is.
I mean, and there's lots of research that says that people don't fall into any of these buckets really. That it's not what the ideological, what you would assume that a candidate believes based on what they think about abortion or what they think about healthcare or this or that. You would assume, okay, well, that means they think this about this, but it's not the way it works. And I definitely think that the folks that are trying to drive the party in a direction with all sorts of data and all sorts of research that suits their purpose definitely dismiss the idea that excitement, enthusiasm, and hope for change is, and I think it comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what drove people to vote for Trump 3 times in the primaries and twice in the presidential, to the point that he won. And a lot of people want to have the simple answer that it's hatred and bigotry, that it's, that it's hostility towards minorities, hostility towards immigrants, that it's hostility towards trans people or gay people or whatever it is, right? And in that informs your decision making as a consultant. And you're like, well, we got to moderate on these things. Like, we got to moderate on immigration and go harder on it. The ironic thing is that because of Trump's insanity around immigration and ICE deportations and pulling people that are working on roofs off of the roofs, they've actually swung the support for immigrants to a relatively high point in the recent history. It's not one of the interesting things about immigration and the way people feel about it is that when you look at the polling on it, that shit moves, man. It's all over the place. It's based on something else. It's not actually how people feel about immigration or immigrants. It's how they feel about themselves and their own security. That's what it, and it comes down to scarcity, and it comes down to fear of me not having enough if there's more people taking. And that's about, it's just not the way an economy works. The more people there are buying stuff and working, the more there is for everybody, theoretically. So yeah, I definitely think that they underestimate that's what Obama ran on. He ran on charisma. He ran on change. He ran on doing things differently. And Tennessee, he only underperformed Bill Clinton by like 6 points in Tennessee. Barack Hussein Obama, right? You don't hear that all the time. 6 point difference than the guy who won it twice. If Barack Obama had a Ross Perot running, he would have won the damn state. So if the Democrats want to win here, they got to recruit Ross Perot to run again. But so yeah, I think absolutely you need candidates with they want to create authenticity instead of do it. And it's one of the most ironic and unauthentic things I've ever seen. You can't get people to say things they don't believe very well, or you have to hire actors, I guess.
Right. Well, so you were at the watch party election night. What was it like there? I mean, I've been at candidate watch parties where the candidate lost by, 5, 6, 7, 8 points, and the mood can be dour because they're losing. But my sense from the video clips that I saw there was that people felt, of course they wanted to win, but it looked like people felt pretty good about the results.
And what's funny is, so I was doing some hits in another room, so they had like a different, where it was quieter. And then every time a dump would happen, and for a little while, Bain was up, right? The crowd would, this is rapturous cheers and everything. So even with that taken into account, that there was moments where she was up big even, right? And there was this hope even being further inflamed that she could possibly win, to do the complete impossible. Even with that level of hope that existed in that room for times, when it was over, there was absolutely all smiles. They knew that they had done something big, which is moving a R22 to an 8 and change. And they knew that they'd done something big because they'd communicated a message to voters. And it created a sense of hope. What we've seen is that there is a vulnerability to the gerrymandering that's happened across this country, ironically. And I saw this in AOC's race against Crowley the first time. This Democratic Party in New York had created a system that suppressed voter turnout in the primaries. Like Alexandria won that race with 16,000 votes in a city or in a district that's mostly Democrats, of around 700,000 people and change. 16,000 votes is what won her that primary. And if you look like Hakeem Jeffries, his last primary, he got 22,000 votes in the whole thing. And then the runner-up got 3,500. And she never even ran a campaign. So what my point is that in New York, the Democratic Party has sort of created a system that makes their incumbents very vulnerable because of low turnout. So if you get people excited, they're very vulnerable. And I believe that Republicans across the country have cut up these very solid blue districts into, to less solidly red districts, and it's going to make them vulnerable. And I think people in that room realized that in their souls, that something big was happening and that they were part of it.
So I don't know how much attention you paid to this one, but the other interesting race that night was this mayor's race in Roswell, Georgia, which is not something that would necessarily normally generate a lot of attention. But Roswell's pretty big, it's pretty affluent, and it's right in the heart of the Atlanta suburbs. And a Democratic, former Democratic state legislator beat a Republican incumbent who'd been endorsed by Governor Brian Kemp. I mean, the Republicans took that race seriously and lost it. I guess, do you see anything there? And I mean, I feel like the Atlanta suburbs are an important battleground heading into next year.
I think there's a lot of glimmers of hope all around I mean, like, one of the things I saw from even the DSA candidates is that they performed pretty well in Mississippi. There's some of them performed well in South Carolina. Won. I don't mean performed well. I mean, won some of these local races and stuff. A change is a-coming. And the question is, the thing I've been saying for a long time is that we're in the middle of a political revolution and have been for over a decade, right? This political revolution sort of really started igniting in its current iteration, I think, with Bernie and Trump. And the Democratic Party decided they were not going to fight in the political revolution. They were going to fight for the political status quo and keeping things normal. And so, the Republicans said no, partly because they have a more democratic nomination process. Not for nothing. If I wanted to run for Congress here in Tennessee, how many votes or how many signatures I have to gather?
Like 25.
I have to gather 25.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go look at New York, go look at California. It's much higher bar than that, right? So part of the problem is that, we didn't want to play as Democrats in this political revolution. We've decided that we're not going to be change agents. We're going to be the return to normalcy candidacies and the return to normal party. But they've underestimated what the thirst and hunger for change is. And I hope this cycle, there's enough candidates, and I believe that it's starting to happen. Like I say, like the Graham Plattners, like this Atlanta candidate that you're talking about in Roswell there, and that are running on different ideas, running on bigger ideas, and accepting that things cannot remain the same. And I think if that happens, I don't think the Democratic Party will change. I think it will be changed. It's not something that one day Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer and these folks are going to wake up and say, you know what, we've been wrong this whole time. We need to really go after, the institutions that have made this, the system that's created this moment in time where America has, been going headlong into authoritarianism. No, that's not going to happen. But what can happen is they can be replaced. And then the people that, a lot of Congress is filled with people that just want to go there and do their work and, and be in the media from time to time. And if the train's going a different direction, they're going to get right on there and they're going to go right along with it.
So I guess looking forward, obviously next year is going to be a really significant election year in many ways. Are there any, thinking about the South in particular, are there any particular places that you're looking at or candidates who you think are especially interesting to watch in that whole cycle? I've not. So I've been putting my effort into systemic analysis lately. So America's Undoing is focusing, which is what the Substack that I publish and the work that I publish is not really been focused so much right now on candidates per se, as it is on the systemic barriers to change. And, most of the folks that I see that are breaking through my sort of narrow vision right now are, of course, bigger candidates, bigger campaigns, right? And so I haven't put, what I think is going to be interesting is if you can see these ideas start spreading down here. If you can see candidates that are running on, not just Medicare for all, but we've got to reopen these rural hospitals. Like the place where I'm from, Sneedville, Tennessee, that's where my people are from, is a town of like 3,000 people in the whole county, rather, not the town. The town's like 1,500 people. A hospital can't survive there for profit. Private equity isn't going to say, oh, this is a great place to put a hospital. Right? It doesn't mean that they don't need one. It doesn't mean they don't need a dialysis center. It just means that the system itself, the market, can't deliver it there. Just like the market couldn't deliver a post office in every zip code. It couldn't do it. If UPS had to maintain these post offices in every zip code, then either you'd be paying $7 to send a letter from Miami to Anchorage, or they just wouldn't exist. They would close them because they wouldn't be profitable. Some things, and I hope these ideas start to percolate down here, have to be done together and for other reasons than just to make money. And this is something that Tennessee used to do. Tennessee has this all through our DNA. It's through our DNA from the New Deal era with the arsenal of democracy that built
Oak Ridge. It's, the highway systems. All of my family worked on those, my uncles and aunts. And, I think that when we see candidates out there start to capture the spirit of building for ourselves, and not like, what's interesting is I'm an Appalachian. I'm from Appalachia, and there's this culture here that I love. And part of that culture is this can-do spirit, right? My papa was a farmer, and he wasn't a welder, but by God, he welded his plows and stuff when they'd break out in the field. There was this thing like, I don't need corporations. I don't need your help. We can do this. And that's what the REA, the Rural Electrification Act, we built the co-ops. We built the stuff. So, do I see any? No, but I would love to hear who do you see down here that's getting exciting and that's starting to look for a different future?
Well, I think that you mentioned Justin Pearson earlier, and I think that race in Memphis is going to be really interesting because that's Steve Cohen's obviously been a pretty reliable liberal vote in Congress, and now our only Democratic representative in Tennessee. But he's in his mid-70s, like a lot of our guys who have been sitting in Congress for a while. And it just strikes me that Pearson is another one of these. And I want to be clear, this is not a partisan show. We're not making endorsements. But Pearson has a lot of that youthful energy that, we saw with Mamdani and with Afton Bain. And he's built to himself a pretty substantial political profile. I think those Georgia races, obviously – the Georgia races next year for governor and for Senate are super important in and of themselves. And then also in terms of looking at the 28 presidential election, right? Because we don't really know Georgia's status right now. Like it had a big, there was the kind of blue wave there in 2020, subsequent elections, not so much. And those look like the places where, like, if we're going to see, and another race that was just highlighted to me recently is the state Supreme Court race in North Carolina next year. Talking about gerrymandering, because the district drawing in North Carolina, of course, is super political like it is everywhere. But we've had, as that Supreme Court has kind of flipped back and forth between Democratic and Republican majorities, they've decided that different kinds of maps are acceptable, and that could also obviously have a huge impact. So I don't know. There's going to be a lot to watch next year, I think.
And you mentioned Pearson, and I'll tell you what I think about that race. In that is you're right. It's our last Democratic representative in the House, and I don't think having a reliable liberal vote is anywhere close to enough for that. That should be a beacon of what the party represents. It should be an outspoken voice that I hear from and I hear about. You're one lone. You should be doing some shenanigans. You should be up to some, good trouble or whatever they call it a lot, because you're one voice now in a state that needs that voice. And when I was doing Justice Democrats, when I first launched it, the first candidate or first incumbent I met with, I took a trip to D.C. I met with two incumbents. One of them was Raul Grijalva, and the other was Steve Cohen. And it was the most depressing meeting I've ever had when I went to sit with Steve Cohen. He was telling me about the heyday of when he was in the state Senate or state legislature, and it was a majority, and he was able to get stuff done. And he was telling me, I don't know, something about some highway speed. I don't even remember what it was, but it was just this sort of look back of all the things that he could do when he was in them, and he was like, I'm here, I'm one of 435, I can't get anything done. And I'm thinking, I'm one of like 300 and something million. That you're my representative, the one, well, there was two at the time, right? But you're one of two reps from Tennessee that's in the blue, and you're just telling me you're not excited, you're depressed, you're bored, you're hopeless. Like, that was one of the most depressing. But at the same time, it made me feel great about what I was doing, because I was starting an organization to primary these people, right? And I was like, well, I'm on the right track. We can't afford that kind of feeling. We can't afford that kind of mentality. I don't care how you vote, because the bills you're getting to vote on aren't that useful. They're not even the biggest ones, the infrastructure, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS Act, all these things that were supposed to be transformational weren't, because they didn't change the system in which they pump trillions of dollars. So by and by, what you get out of it, you pump trillions of dollars into a system that generates shit, and out of it comes, guess what, more shit. And, so we can't afford to go through accepting that people vote okay. That's no longer what we need as a party. We need people that lead and change the minds and the hearts of Americans and help us get towards supermajorities again so we can fix stuff.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Thanks again, and maybe sometime next year as some of these races come into focus, we can do it again.
Can't wait.
All right. Take care.
You as well.
Steve Cropper died last week, on December 3rd, at the age of 84. He had a long music career, but he was best known for his work as the guitarist with the seminal Memphis soul band Booker T and the MGs. Led by the keyboard player Booker T. Jones, and also including drummer Al Jackson Jr. and bass player Donald Duck Dunn, the MGs were famous for their own instrumental hits, especially Green Onions and Time Is Tight, which we just heard part of there in a 1970 live performance, and maybe even more as the house band at Memphis's legendary Stax label. The quartet provided indelible grooves on hits by stars like Rufus and Carla Thomas, Wilson Pickett, Sam and Dave, and Otis Redding. Cropper was especially close to Redding, with whom he co-wrote Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay. Other songs he co-wrote included In the Midnight Hour with Wilson Pickett and Knock on Wood with Eddie Floyd. He was famous for his restrained, tasteful, and always funky playing, consisting of forceful riffs and cleanly picked single notes. He earned praise from peers like the Rolling Stones' Keith Richards, who called his playing perfect, and The Who's Pete Townshend, who once called Cropper the most incredible guitarist in history. And he wasn't just a player. He was a key part of the whole Stax operation, serving as A&R director and producing a lot of the label's sessions. Stax co-owner Jim Stewart called Cropper his right-hand man. The MGs were very much products of Memphis, both its rich musical heritage and its racial diversity. As a mixed-race band, Cropper and Dunn were white, Jones and Jackson were black. They embodied an ideal of harmony that their city has long struggled to achieve. They weren't exactly political, although they weren't blind to the world around them. Time Is Tight was originally written and recorded for the soundtrack to a 1968 film called Uptight, about black revolutionaries in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which of course also happened in Memphis. Although he was well known to music fans and beloved by musicians, Cropper's name was never as familiar as those of the Stax stars. But it does show up on at least one classic record. On the Sam and Dave smash Soul Man, which went to number 2 in 1967, after a tasty guitar lick in the chorus, singer Sam Moore shouts, "Play it, Steve!" which he would repeat in live performances. It would be hard to list all the classic songs Cropper played on, wrote and co-wrote, or produced. It is fair to say that Booker T and the MGs were in many ways the heart of Stax, and by extension of all of Southern soul music. He'll be missed, but we'll be hearing him for a long time.
I'm a soul man. Come on, Steve. Yes, sir. I'm a soul man, baby.
And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. If you do feel moved to make a donation, thank you. Thanks to Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. You can also write me at jmayshark@theprogressivesouth.org. We'll talk to you later.